The first time it happened, I was 8 years old. Christmas Eve had always been quiet in our house, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like my parents were afraid of making too much noise and disturbing something fragile. Snow pressed itself against the windows in thick white sheets, muting the world outside. The streetlights glowed dimly through the frost, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I remember the clock above the fireplace clearly. The red digital numbers burned into my memory. 3:17 a.m. That was the moment the knock came. It wasn't loud, it wasn't frantic. It was slow, measured, and patient. 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart, as if whoever stood on the other side of our front door knew exactly how long to wait between them. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, the blankets tangled around my legs. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Christmas dreams have a way of bleeding into reality, especially when you're young. I listened, holding my breath, staring at the dark shape of my bedroom door. Then came the second knock. My stomach dropped. Down the hallway, I heard my parents' bedroom door creak open. Soft footsteps followed, slow and hesitant. No voices, no whispers. That silence was worse than any scream. I slipped out of bed and cracked my door open just enough to peer into the hallway. The house looked different at night, unfamiliar and distorted by shadows. The Christmas tree at the end of the hall glowed faintly, its colored lights reflecting off ornaments like tiny, watchful eyes. My mother stood at the top of the stairs, wrapped in her robe, one hand gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles were white. My father stood behind her, his face pale, his jaw clenched. Neither of them spoke. They didn't even look at each other. The knock came again. 3 knocks, always 3. My mother closed her eyes just for a second, like someone bracing for bad news they already knew was coming. Then she descended the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, loud in the stillness. My father followed, slower, reluctant, as if the floor itself were pulling him back. I wanted to call out to them, to ask who was there, but something in the air told me not to. The house felt tense, like it was holding its breath. From the hallway, I watched as they reached the front door. My mother hesitated, her hand hovering inches from the doorknob. She glanced at the clock mounted near the entryway. 3:17 a.m. She swallowed hard. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer came, only the faint sound of wind pushing snow against the door. My father leaned close to her ear and murmured something I couldn't hear. Whatever he said made her shoulders sag, like the weight of it pressed straight down her spine. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned the lock. The door opened. I couldn't see who stood outside from where I was. The porch light flickered on, casting a pale yellow glow into the entryway. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of snow and something else, something old and stale, like damp fabric left too long in a closed space. My mother gasped. My father took a step back. "Please," my mother whispered, "not tonight." Still, no response came from whoever stood at the door. There was only silence, heavy and deliberate. After a long moment, my father reached forward and closed the door again, locking it with trembling hands. My mother leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow and uneven. For a long time, neither of them moved. Finally, my father turned off the porch light. That was when I noticed something on the floor. A small object rested on the welcome mat just inside the door. It hadn't been there before. Even from the hallway, I could see it clearly. A neatly wrapped package, no bigger than a shoebox, covered in plain brown paper and tied with thin red string. My mother stared at it like it might explode. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice cracking. My father didn't answer. He just picked up the package and carried it into the living room, setting it down beneath the Christmas tree. The colored lights reflected off the red string, making it look almost festive, almost normal. Neither of them noticed me standing in the hallway. I watched as they returned upstairs without another word, leaving the gift behind, leaving it there, waiting. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, Christmas morning, my parents acted like nothing had happened. Laughter filled the house, breakfast was made, presents were opened. But the small brown package was gone. When I asked about it, my mother froze. My father's smile faded just enough for me to notice. "That was never for us," my mother said, quietly. Years later, I would learn that the knock never stopped. Every Christmas, every year, always at 3:17 a.m. And whoever stood on the other side of our door never aged, never spoke, and never stopped coming. By the time I turned 12, the rule had already been carved into my bones. If someone knocks at 3:17 a.m. on Christmas morning, you do not open the door. You do not speak, you do not look through the peephole, you do not turn on the porch light. You wait. I never questioned the rule when I was younger. Children accept fear the way they accept gravity. It simply exists. But as I grew older, the rule became heavier, more deliberate, as if it was less about superstition and more about survival. That Christmas Eve, the house felt different long before the clock reached midnight. The air inside was too still, thick with the smell of pine needles and extinguished candles. The Christmas tree lights glowed softly in the living room, casting long shadows across the walls, shadows that didn't quite match the branches that made them. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual, every second echoing like it was being counted by something else. My parents sat on opposite ends of the living room, pretending to read. Neither of them turned a page. I lay on the carpet, staring at the underside of the coffee table, listening to the subtle creaks of the house settling in the cold. Every sound made my stomach tighten. The furnace hummed, then fell silent. The wind brushed against the siding like fingertips testing the surface of the house. No one spoke. That was another unspoken rule. On Christmas Eve after midnight, we didn't talk unless we absolutely had to. Words had a way of traveling, of carrying attention. At 2:45 a.m., my mother stood up and quietly locked the front door, even though it had already been locked since dinner. She checked it twice, her hand lingering on the deadbolt longer than necessary. My father went to the windows, one by one, pulling the curtains closed with slow, careful movements. When he reached the front window, he hesitated. I sat up. "What is it?" I whispered, breaking the silence without meaning to. My father didn't answer right away. He stared through a narrow gap in the curtains, his shoulders stiff, his breath shallow. After a long moment, he closed the fabric completely. "Nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Go back to lying down." I obeyed, but sleep was impossible. The clock ticked on. 2:58, 3:01, 3:05. Each minute felt stretched thin, like time itself was reluctant to move forward. I watched the second hand crawl, my heartbeat syncing with its rhythm. At 3:12 a.m., the lights flickered. Just once, a brief dimming that made my chest seize. My mother flinched, her fingers gripping the arm of the couch so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Power's fine," my father said quietly, more to himself than to us. 3:14. The house felt smaller now, as if the walls had shifted inward, subtly, imperceptibly, but enough to make breathing harder. Even the Christmas tree lights seemed dimmer, their warm glow dulled by the weight of the moment approaching. 3:16. My mother stood and turned off the living room lamp. The room sank into shadow, lit only by the tree and the faint moonlight slipping to the edges of the curtains. "Remember," she whispered, finally meeting my eyes, "no matter what you hear." I nodded. Then the clock clicked over. 3:17 a.m. The knock came immediately. 3 slow taps. Not loud, not aggressive, measured,
deliberate. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my lips together to keep from making a sound. The knock echoed through the house, vibrating in the floorboards beneath me. No one moved. Seconds passed. Then the knock came again. 3 tops, slightly closer together this time. It sounded patient. I could hear my own pulse roaring in my ears. My eyes darted toward the front door, even though I knew better than to look directly at it. The door was solid oak, thick and old, its surface scarred with years of use. It had always made me feel safe. That night, it felt thin. Another knock. This time, something changed. The sound carried a subtle familiarity, like it knew the shape of the house, like it had knocked on that door before, many times. I noticed then that the wind had stopped. The house was completely silent except for the ticking clock and the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cold. Then came the voice. It was soft, too soft. "Merry Christmas," it said. The voice was close to the door, but somehow distant at the same time, as if it wasn't traveling through air, but through the walls themselves. It sounded calm, polite, almost warm. I swallowed hard. The voice spoke again. "I know you're awake." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father closed his eyes, just for a second, as if bracing himself. "We've been doing this a long time. You know the routine." It laughed quietly. Not a laugh of joy, a sound like breath escaping cold lungs. "I don't need much. Just a moment. Just a look." The doorknob twitched. Not a turn, just a gentle test, a reminder that it could touch the house even if it couldn't enter. My chest felt tight, like something heavy was sitting on it. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run upstairs and bury myself under blankets, but my body refused to move. The voice sighed. "Still teaching the child the old rules. That's good, important." It paused. "But rules change." My mother shook her head slowly, silently, tears streaming down her face. The knocking stopped. For a brief, terrible moment, I thought it was over. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not outside, inside the walls. Slow, deliberate steps, moving along the hallway, stopping just outside the living room. I stared at the dark doorway, my vision blurring, my breath shallow and uneven. The voice came again, closer now. "I'll see you next year," it whispered. The footsteps faded. The pressure in the air lifted slightly. The house exhaled. At exactly 3:18 a.m., the clock ticked forward and the spell broke. The wind returned, the furnace kicked back on, the world resumed its rhythm as if nothing had happened. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, my father stood and checked the door. It was still locked. No scratches, no marks, no sign that anyone had been there. But when he turned around, his face was pale. "The rules worked," he said quietly. My mother nodded, wiping her eyes. But something about the way she looked at me told me the truth. The rules hadn't stopped it. They had only delayed it. And as I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something else. The voice hadn't sounded angry. It had sounded patient. The house was deathly silent as I lay in bed, unable to shake the memory of last night's knock. Every clock in the living room, every hum of the refrigerator, every distant car passing down the empty street reminded me that the hour would come again. I had tried everything, staying awake, sleeping in a different room, even pretending I didn't hear the sound. But no matter what I did, 3:17 a.m. arrived with a certainty that terrified me more than I could articulate. That night, as the minute hand crawled towards 17 past 3, the sensation returned. It wasn't just anticipation. It was something physical, a pressure in the air, a vibration in the floorboards, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel sweat prickling the back of my neck. I gripped the sheets tightly, praying it would not come. Yet, deep down, I knew the moment was inevitable. The first knock echoed through the hallway, low and deliberate. Not a hurried tap, but slow, precise, deliberate. My stomach clenched. The sound reverberated through the house, yet it felt wrong somehow. The knock carried weight, almost as if it were coming from inside the walls rather than the door itself. I wanted to rationalize it, tell myself it was the wind or a tree branch striking the siding, but my gut screamed otherwise. I crept toward the living room, bare feet brushing the cold wooden floor. The hall seemed longer than usual, stretching into darkness. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened as I approached the door. A low moan of wind outside carried through the cracks, but the sound of the knock persisted, unwavering. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The metal felt ice cold beneath my fingers, far colder than the winter air outside. I peered through the peephole. The street was empty, nothing but snow falling silently, blanketing the world in white. I blinked, adjusting my eyes, and then I saw it, or thought I did. At first, it was just a shadow, thin and indistinct, barely visible in the muted glow of the street lamp. But when I focused, it became clearer. A figure, standing at the edge of the porch, unnaturally still, shoulders stiff, head slightly tilted. My heart skipped a beat. There was no breath visible in the frigid air. No footprints in the fresh snow led up to the door. It had appeared without leaving any trace. I stepped back instinctively, my hand tightening around the doorknob. My mind raced, grasping for an explanation. Someone was playing a trick, a prankster maybe, aware of the local legend. But then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. And I realized with horror, the figure had moved. Closer. Far too close to the door for it to be anyone who had been standing in the yard minutes ago. The lights flickered, casting the living room in brief, strobing shadows. The figure's form became more defined, yet impossible. Its edges shimmered slightly like heat haze, and its shape wavered as if reality itself was bending around it. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed that I should not open the door. Every instinct screamed that I had no choice. Another knock, louder, faster. It wasn't in rhythm now, it was chaotic, desperate. My hands shook as I reached for the door, hesitating, the edge of panic clawing at my mind. And then something new. A whisper, low, almost imperceptible, carried through the keyhole, brushing against my ear. Let me in. I stumbled back, my heart nearly stopping. The voice was hollow, distant, yet inside my head I heard it clearly as if it had spoken beside me. It was not human. There was a coldness to it, a void, an absence of warmth that made my skin crawl. I wanted to deny it, to close my eyes and pretend it wasn't there, but the next knock shattered any illusion, sharp, sudden, reverberating through the walls like a hammer. Something shifted in the room. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on my chest. The shadows cast by the furniture stretched and warped, forming shapes that seemed to move independently of the light. My gaze darted to the corner and I thought I saw a face, pale, indistinct, eyes black hollows, peering at me from the darkness. When I blinked, it was gone. I stepped back tentatively, my foot hit the rug, and for a brief moment I could hear another sound, a scraping, low and deliberate, like claws against the wooden floor. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the house. Every nerve in my body screamed. My logical mind tried to rationalize it, but the presence was undeniable. The figure at the door was no longer merely knocking. It had somehow entered, creeping closer in ways my mind could not understand. Another knock, deafening in its intensity, shattered the silence. The doorknob rattled violently as if someone or something were trying to force the door open. I flinched, my hands flying to the lock, but it was too late. The door shook once more, then suddenly stopped. Silence. A cold wind swept through the hall, brushing against my face, carrying the faint scent of decayed pine and frost. I dared a glance through the peephole again. The street outside was empty. No figure, no footprints, nothing. And yet I knew it was still there. I could feel it, pressing against the other side of the door, waiting. The whispers returned louder now, more urgent. "Open, I've come for you, it's time." My hands trembled as I reached for the deadbolt, my knuckles white. I wanted to call for someone, scream into the night, run, anything, but I couldn't move fast enough. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, layered voices, each one insistent, each one hungry. I realized then with paralyzing fear, it was not human. It never had been, and it wasn't alone. The knocks began again, faster, relentless, a pounding rhythm that matched my heartbeat. My vision blurred with terror, sweat dripping down my face, my mind racing. I could feel a cold pressure seep through the door, brushing against my fingers, my hands, my face. The whispers grew deafening in my skull. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug, landing hard on the floor. The door shook me violently once more, then silence again. I dared not look. I dared not breathe. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the whispers penetrated, threading through my mind like icy needles. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room was silent. My pulse thundered in my ears. My body shook uncontrollably. I dared a glance at the door. Nothing. No scratches, no distortion, no sign that it had been assaulted. The hallway beyond the door was empty, shadows still and heavy. The night outside was calm, quiet, unbroken. Yet I knew that it had been here. I could feel it. Deep in my chest, in my bones, in my mind, I felt the presence lingering, watching, waiting. The hour would come again, and again. Every Christmas, without fail, at 3:17 a.m., it would return. I realized in that frozen, terror-stricken moment that there was no stopping it. No barricade, no lock, no rational explanation. The presence had marked me, and as long as I lived in this house, it would come. Every year, every night, every 3:17 a.m. Until I could not even imagine what the end would be. I lay on the floor for hours, trembling, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The house was empty, silent, normal. The street outside was as mundane as ever. Yet I could not shake the memory, the weight, the knowing that tonight was only a pause. And next year, when the clock struck 3:17, the knock would come again, and I would answer. That Christmas Eve, I could feel the presence long before 3:17 a.m. The house seemed heavier, the shadows longer, the silence thick and almost suffocating. Every sound, the tick of the clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing against the windows felt amplified, as though the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the door, knees drawn to my chest, my heart hammering like a drum in my ears. I tried to tell myself it would not come. I tried to reason that perhaps last year had been an anomaly, a coincidence, the work of some prankster. But deep down, I knew better. I had felt it, its pull, its intent. The knock was no mere sound, it was a summons, and it would arrive exactly when it wanted, at the hour it had claimed as its own. The clock ticked closer to 3:17. I counted each second in my mind, trembling as the minute hand crept forward. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move independently now, as though the house itself were alive, aware of what was about to happen. Then, precisely, the knock came. It was not a timid tap. It was sharp, deliberate, rhythmic, echoing through the hallway like a hammer striking a hollow coffin. My pulse jumped into my throat. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. My mind screamed to run, to hide, to lock every door, yet my body was paralyzed by fear. I approached the door slowly.
each step measured and trembling. Through the peephole, the world outside was unnervingly still. Snow drifted softly, untouched by footprints. No figure stood in the weak glow of the streetlight. Nothing. And yet, I knew. I felt it in my bones, pressing against the door, a cold, silent weight that pressed through the wood and seeped into my chest. Another knock, louder this time, and then a third, urgent, insistent. The knocking was no longer rhythmic. It was chaotic, almost desperate, as if the entity were testing my resolve. I could hear faint whispers now, carried through the crack of the door, low, hissing voices that brushed against my ears, impossible to understand, yet clear in their intent. Open. You must. It is time. I recoiled, heart racing, sweat stinging my eyes. The whispers were insistent, overlapping, layering into a chorus of cold commands that burrowed into my skull. I pressed my hands against the door, trying to block the sound, but it penetrated, threading through my mind like icy needles. Something shifted in the hallway. The shadows cast by the furniture grew darker, stretching across the walls. Shapes emerged within them, vague outlines of figures, distorted and unnatural, shifting as though watching me. My breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to turn on the lights, to call for help, to scream, but my body refused. I was rooted in place, trapped by a force I could neither see nor comprehend. The knock came again, louder, almost violent. The doorknob rattled, and for the first time I felt a pressure, like hands pressing against it from the other side. My heart leapt. I could sense the entity there, just beyond the door, patient and relentless, waiting for me to yield. It did not speak aloud. It did not need to. Its presence alone was enough to terrify me into submission. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, and landed hard on the floor. The cold seeped through my clothes, biting at my skin, but I hardly noticed. My eyes darted to the shadows in the corners. Faces formed in the darkness, hollow eyes, twisted mouths, fleeting and impossible to focus on. They watched me. They waited. And then, through the overlapping whispers, one voice, clearer, sharper, commanding, cut through the others. Open the door. Open it. My hands went to the deadbolts, trembling uncontrollably. I knew with a sick certainty that if I did, I would see it. If I did, I would confirm the truth I'd long suspected. This was not human. This was something else, something patient, something eternal, and it had come for me. The next knock was different. It was deliberate, slow, almost polite, and yet the force behind it pressed through the door like icy fingers curling around my spine. I felt my knees give way, my body falling forward toward the door. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the knob. I hesitated. Time stretched. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and unrelenting, drowning out everything else. And then a sound I had never expected. A whisper, not from the other side of the door, but from inside the house itself. You know it is here. You know it waits. The whisper came from the shadows in the corner, from the darkness behind me. My head snapped around. The room was empty, or at least it seemed so. The shadows flickered as though alive, forming shapes that moved independently, twisting and coiling toward me. Panic surged, and I scrambled backward, crashing into the couch, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. The sound barely registered to me over the pounding of my pulse. The knocking did not stop. In fact, it grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the house as though amplified by some unseen force. The doorknob rattled violently, then stilled, and I realized with horror it had not been knocking in the normal way. It had been testing me, gauging my fear, drawing me closer to the edge. The presence was patient, almost theatrical, waiting for the precise moment of submission. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, my mind racing. Every rational explanation had failed me. No prankster could appear out of thin air, leave no footprints, whisper in voices that sounded inside my skull. No logical mind could account for the sensation of something pressing through the wood, of shadows moving independently, of whispers threading into my thoughts. I understood now that I was not dealing with a human threat. This was something older, something patient, something that had marked me long ago. The next knock was the loudest yet, reverberating through the house, shaking the floorboards beneath me. I dared not look at the door directly. My eyes flicked to the clock. 3:17. The hour had arrived. The entity had come, and I had nowhere to hide. A sudden movement in the hallway caught my eye. The shadows shifted, coalescing into a vague human shape, stretching impossibly. It stood near the door, faceless, featureless, exuding a presence so cold it made my teeth chatter. The whispers surged into my mind, overlapping with one another, forming a chorus of commands and threats. "Open. It is time. We are waiting." I could feel the pressure behind the door again, stronger, heavier, as if invisible hands were pressing against it, testing it. My body was trembling violently. I knew that if I yielded, if I opened the door, the entity would step inside. And yet, I could not ignore it. I was trapped in a cruel limbo of fear and compulsion, caught between resistance and surrender. Minutes, or what felt like hours, passed. The house was filled with the sound of knocking, whispering, the subtle creak of shadows moving in the corners. My mind screamed for escape, yet I could not move. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking ceased. Silence fell heavy and unnatural, broken only by the ragged rhythm of my heartbeat. I dared a glance at the door. The street outside was empty, snow untouched, the weak glow of the street lamp illuminating nothing. And yet, I knew. I felt it in my bones, pressing against the door, a cold, silent weight that pressed through the wood and seeped into my chest. I sank to the floor, trembling, unable to speak, unable to breathe normally. I understood now with absolute clarity. This was not a single night, not a single event. Every Christmas, every 3:17 a.m., it would return. There was no reason, no logic, no escape. And next year, I would hear the knock again. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, to will it away, but deep down, I knew nothing could stop it. The presence had marked me, and I would forever live under its shadow. The knock was patient. It waited, and I would never forget the sound. Christmas Eve had never felt heavier. The air inside the house was thick, as if gravity itself had increased. Every shadow loomed larger, stretching across the walls, creeping along the floor like black water. I had barricaded every door and window I could, yet the oppressive certainty that it would come again made me shiver uncontrollably. The clock ticked toward 3:17 a.m., each second echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. I stayed crouched behind the couch, breath shallow, every nerve taut. I knew what was coming, and yet a part of me refused to accept it. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, a residual terror left over from the previous years. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen the impossible, the faceless figure, the shadows that moved independently, the whispers that invaded my mind. And tonight, it would not merely knock. At precisely 3:17, it began. The knock was slow at first, deliberate, testing. Then it quickened, insistent, almost demanding. I could feel the vibration through the floor, through my body, through the very air. The house seemed to groan and shift around me, the walls breathing, stretching as though alive. I dared not peek through the peephole. My eyes were fixed on the shadows gathering in the corners of the living room. They moved differently this year, more purposeful, forming shapes that I could not entirely comprehend. Faces appeared, hollow eyes, gaping mouths, expressions of eternal longing and hunger. I could feel their gaze pressing into my mind, urging me to respond, to yield. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft but unmistakable, coming from the door. "Open or join us." I froze, my blood turning cold. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. I realized that the entity wasn't content with fear alone. It wanted participation, my acquiescence. I shook my head, trying to deny it, to remind myself that I was safe behind the door. But the air thickened, almost physical, pressing against my chest and shoulders. The knocking grew louder, echoing in impossible rhythms, and now it was joined by another sound, faint scraping, like claws against the wood, moving closer, circling, probing. A shadow moved across the room, impossibly fast. It was taller than any human, its form shifting and wavering, edges flickering like smoke. My heart pounded in terror as it approached, its presence suffocating, carrying with it a cold that burned through my bones. I could hear whispers again, overlapping, layered, deafening. "Open, you know the way, join us." I scrambled backward, tripping over the rug, landing hard against the wall. My hands shook uncontrollably. Every rational thought had abandoned me. Logic, reason, fear, all meaningless. This thing existed, it was here, and it would not be denied. Then came the final knock, the one I had been dreading. Slow, deliberate, filled with authority. The doorknob rattled violently. The air outside the door shifted, a presence pressing directly against the wood. I could feel it, massive and patient, as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment. My mind screamed, my body trembled, but I could not move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear and inevitability. A voice, clear and cold, whispered directly into my mind. "It is time. Open or be forever part of the night." I knew then that resistance was futile. My hand rose toward the doorknob, shaking violently, yet compelled by something beyond my understanding. I wanted to scream, to flee, to destroy the door, but my body had betrayed me. The entity's will was stronger than my own. As my fingers closed around the cold metal, the shadows in the corners surged, coalescing into a massive, twisting shape that filled the room. Faces, mouths, eyes all shifting, moving in unnatural synchronization. I could feel their hunger, their need, their expectation. The whispers became a roar in my mind, and every instinct screamed that the moment had come. I turned the knob. The door creaked open, and the night poured in. Not the night of stars or moonlight, but a darkness deeper than any shadow, alive with whispers, coiling tendrils that slid across the floor and walls like liquid smoke. The air was icy, tasting of frost and decay. My heart raced, pounding in terror and awe. Through the darkness, I saw it, a faceless figure, taller than any human, standing silently on the porch. Its form shimmered, edges impossible, undulating like smoke in the wind. It stepped inside. The shadows followed, spreading across the room, merging with the darkness that had entered. I stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The house had become a vessel for this entity, every corner alive with presence, every shadow moving with intent. My pulse thundered in my ears as it advanced toward me. The whispers became intelligible, a chorus of demands and promises. Join us. You belong. The night is eternal. I tried to speak, to fight, to resist. My voice caught in my throat. My hands shook. Every ounce of courage and willpower slipped away under the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. I realized with horror that this was not just a visit, this was a claim, and I was helpless to resist. The faceless figure reached toward me, its hand passing through the physical world like mist. The shadows followed, enveloping me, coiling around my arms and legs, lifting me off the ground. I screamed, a sound swallowed instantly by the darkness. My mind was invaded by 1,000 voices, overlapping, whispering, promising, threatening. And then, silence. I found myself standing outside the house, snow falling silently around me, the first light of dawn breaking weakly across the horizon. The door was closed. The house was still, empty. And yet, I knew. I had been marked. Part of me had been taken. Part of me remains tethered to the darkness that would return next Christmas at 3:17 a.m. I stumbled to the street, shivering, heart hammering, unable to comprehend what had occurred. I knew I would not sleep tonight, tomorrow, or the next year. Every Christmas, at the same hour, it would come again. And every year, it would claim a part of me until there was nothing left. The street remained silent, the snow untouched, serene, deceivingly calm. But the memory of the knock, of the shadows, of the faceless figure lingered in my mind, coiling like a serpent, ready to return. I understood now that there was no escape, no refuge. The presence was patient, eternal, and relentless. As I gazed back at the house, the memory of the knock echoed in my ears. It was not merely a sound, it was a promise, and I knew deep in my bones that I would answer next year, because the visitor always comes, and at 3:17 a.m., I will always hear the knock.